It is Monday, October the 21st, 2019. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, part 2 of the Peasants' Revolt. Yes, we're going to wrap up the action proper of the summer of 1381 today. Talk a little bit more about how the peasants pressed their advantage and how they were ultimately dealt with by the forces of order. Of course, before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that this show, like all these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you, folks who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. The list of people on that page is a list of some of the finest specimens of humanity you were ever likely to find. There's also a PayPal link, paypal.me/distantpeasant, where you can make one-time donations to support all the work that I put into crafting this fine audio product for you. Thank you in advance. On with the show. When we last left our heroes, and so I will name them, and thus confess my sympathies, they were mostly massing in the English counties of Essex and Kent, though before the summer was out, revolts had broken up across much of England. Now the peasants of the eponymous Peasants' Revolt were greatly inflamed, and it is time to stop before we go any further and give these people further treatment. Now hold on, you might say. Haven't we already introduced them pretty well enough already? All that about the massive rural population, the agricultural industry, the wars and the plague, and the longbowmen. Don't we know these people already? Aren't they, as I might put it, that simple mass of people, usually just called ordinary, regular, unimportant, working? The ones who do all the goddamn labor around here and always have, and yet are seen as all the less for it. They wear no crowns, they enjoy no public titles, they do not hold office. Common folk. So I might put it today. And it's certainly the way I see things, more or less. But truth be told, there ain't no peasants in 1381. And this ain't really a revolt. Now, as for the revolt part, well, this is quite a bit bigger, better organized, and longer lasting than your average revolt. Rebellion is probably closer to my preferred term, though some folks don't like that either. I prefer to call it a rising or even a protest, which, come on, that shit sucks. As for the peasants part, the word peasant almost certainly didn't exist at the time, and in any case wasn't in the top nomenclature of the day. Wouldn't be till the next century that we have evidence of its existence. People spoke instead of serfs and villeins and yeomen. And though it's a natural inclination for people like us to simply group all of them together and call them the common folk, do all the work around here, they weren't all really peasants. Some of them were serfs. These are little better than slaves. They have almost no rights and privileges in England. They were to do as they were told, pay their taxes as instructed, never travel or marry without permission, could not hold property, etc., as their descendants had done for countless generations before them, and they and theirs would do after them until the end of time. That was the idea, anyway. Others of them were not serfs, but still landless laborers, working in an interconnected, though nascent market economy, based on large amounts of sea trade with the continent. A small but growing group of people in medieval England. Some of them, perhaps more of them, were villeins, a sort of step above serfs, but without the full rights of yeomen. They had obligations to a manor and a lord, but could usually hold property. And outside of the manor and lord to which they were pledged, they were free men in the eyes of the law. Broadly speaking, their status had more to do with the land that they held and farmed than the blood in their veins. Some of them were yeomen, which was a free man who can own his own plot. And there were even a couple knights, gentry, even a few members of parliament at the top of the revolt. Now, yeomen are free, often because they or their descendants had purchased their way out of feudal obligations with the lord's permission. Though yeoman also refers to the personal attendants in noble households, and sometimes yeomen held mostly lower level duties and powers in their community. It was these yeoman types who most often had or could get a longbow or two and knew how to use them. Could maybe even teach others how to do the same. But the one thing that all of them had in common, serfs, villeins, yeomen, even your lesser gentry, is that they're all feeling particularly exploited, put upon by ever more onerous taxes and duties from the kingdom's ruling classes in the wake of generations of war, plague, and famine. And they have some very practical ideas on how to situate things more to their liking. In any case, all these rebels, peasants or not, will coalesce around some pretty momentous demands. Demands that contain a healthy mix of practicality and revolution, in my opinion. Their first demand was an end to bonded labor and serfdom. No more would any person in England be forced to work without pay on a particular estate or for a particular lordship, but would instead be free to sell their labor wherever they chose. Free to sell their goods at whatever market they chose, free to buy or rent out their properties to whomever they chose. Speaking of property, they also wanted massive land reform and redistribution. National rent control was to be set at 4 pence per acre, and all the great noble and church estates returned to the commons, save for a bit set aside for the former nobles to live and make a living on. Villages would return to the ancient communal management of these surrounding lands. This is also not just a matter of economic rights either. The rebels wanted all those nobles, gentry, husbandmen, yeomen, villeins, and serfs of England to all be the same now, all free and equal under the eyes of the kingdom, with access to the same justice, and all under the same king, of course. They'll also be wanting to get rid of the entire hierarchical structure of the church. Just an archbishop at the top will do, thank you. And they'll be needing an official declaration of amnesty for anyone taking part in the revolt from your grace, so that all is right and proper and legal in English fashion. And probably their least surprising demand, the rebels also had a list of people they'd very much like to have handed over to them in the name of justice. Men like John of Gaunt, who owned the awesome poll tax idea, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, who had locked up poor John Ball, the king's money man, Robert Hales, better known as Hob the Robber, and quite a few others. We wouldn't want a king to have to worry about dealing with such grimy matters himself, so if you ask me, it was actually really nice of the rebels to offer to do the dirty work for him. So now that we know a little bit more about the rebels and what they wanted, before we return to the action, let's talk a little bit about these demands. Much of the program desired by these largely illiterate people smacks of, well, the Enlightenment, centuries before even the Renaissance gets started. We're talking about a free market for labor and goods, rights to property, equality under the law. We may still just be talking about men here, unfortunately. But this was still a list of demands to drastically expand economic and political rights across the whole of the kingdom in meaningful and practical fashion. Respect, for being ahead of their time, I think. Now, this all might smack of a bit of proto-capitalism, perhaps, but it should be colored somewhat by their concurrent demands for massive land reform and redistribution. London itself, as an example, has perhaps 40,000 people living in it at this time, in 1381. All the cities of England and most of the world are small, the countryside vast, land ownership highly concentrated, rental rates compulsively set. And it ain't like you could just go down the road and find a cheaper offer from someone else. So returning the vast majority of the land of England to the commons and communal management was an even bigger deal than it might seem at first glance. At a time when elections, constitutions, labor unions, and the franchise are all still concepts that more or less don't exist in the world, They demanded radical equality under God and the king. And both the crown and the church would be radically flattened in structure, made closer to their people. As for their list of men they wanted to brutally execute, much has been made of this from the very first, by the very first chroniclers of the Revolt. And yes, this mob did want blood. But whether that was justice or vengeance or both is not as easy to discern as you might think. One point I'd add in favor of the rebels is that though they wanted blood, the king's men wanted it just as badly, and would spill it as ruthlessly and sadistically as any rebel could ever dream later. And most importantly, they'll be killing many, many, many more folk than the rebels would ever dream of. We also shouldn't forget that this is medieval times, after all, when the most humane way to execute someone was to chop off their head with a sword or an axe. And there were probably dozens of ways to be tortured to death instead of that. If execution by guillotine seems a horror to you, as it does to me, it's worth it to consider that many condemned people at this time in history would have greatly preferred it to the methods employed. Anyway, rebels better defined, their demands introduced, and a bit of context given to their demands. Let's go back to the action. As I think I mentioned before, there will be other revolts popping up in semi-coordinated fashion during the summer of 1381 in other places. But as for Wat Tyler and his Kentish forces, they'll go through this town and that one on the way to London, importantly stopping off at Canterbury to perform a routine that will be performed repeatedly during the coming weeks. Canterbury was a city that was walled with a castle, and which let them walk right in. Once they did so, they declared the archbishop deposed. They had all the priests and monks swear loyalty to their cause of the king and the true commons, as they put it. They let out all the prisoners in the king's jail and made sure to execute the town's worst nobles, of course. Amazingly, there wasn't much looting. In fact, looting was discouraged or even prohibited. And by the time the rebels get to London, they'll be punishing people by death for looting stuff, believe it or not. However, they did smash furniture, tore fine clothes, mangled gold and silver dishes, crushed gemstones, burned things down. And though doubtless people here or there probably took things and tucked them safely away, this rebellion was really not about looting the wealth of the country. Their number one objective everywhere they hit, in fact, was not wanton destruction, but incredibly targeted destruction. Tax records, census rolls, documentations of fines and fees, destroying all of this shit. It was absolutely priority number one for the vast majority of rebels. Whatever else happened, if the nobles wanted to try another one of these bullshit head taxes to fund the king's foreign wars and their own fine lifestyles, they were going to need to start from scratch. In fact, of the few scraps of letters left to us written by the rebels that were sent out to towns and villages across England, they mostly contain what seems like direct instructions to go to this manor or that one and burn the rolls, or head to this place or that one and start mustering the small folk of the land to get this revolution going. Now, as these people, mostly from Essex and Kent, but all over, began coalescing to head to London and have a chat with His Majesty, His Grace was in the Tower of London with his closest advisors. Now, the king in question is only 14 years old, and during his reign, effective control of the government would drift between him and the great nobles of the land. Being so young right now, real power likely lies in men around the king, who is named Richard II. Considering the hints among the primary sources of the time, however, and the way this will all end, it's not really fair to paint him as some hapless puppet during these events. He may not have been in charge exactly, but he was certainly there for and contributed to all deliberations and actions, and he will play a central role in the revolt's final act. Anyway, all these big, important men are sitting around this fancy tower trying to figure out what to do about the rebels. And honestly, I have no idea how many people were rebelling in total and how many were marching on London, and neither did they. Some sources at the time give numbers in the hundreds of thousands. This is probably way too high, though if you count up each and every soul who ever contributed anything at all to the revolt in any way throughout the whole of England, you might reach that number. In terms of the number marching on London, it was probably in the low tens of thousands, with England itself probably having only a little more than 1 million people in it total. It's likely there's some exaggeration and fear among the noble reportage of the time, but what is certain is that there were a bunch of them, and that they were armed, and some of them were even really, really well armed. And by a bunch, I mean they had clear numerical superiority by orders of magnitude over the men-at-arms the king could possibly muster at the time. The closest army of any consequential size was all the way in Scotland at the moment. The king's more experienced soldiers in France and Ireland and Germany, but he had only a few hundred men at hand. So, things being the way they were, there were really only two courses, negotiation or surrender. And the crown chose negotiation. Well, kind of. You see, for a negotiation, the forces of order will do very little, if any, haggling with the rebels at all throughout the events of the summer of 1381. They will instead stall for time a bit, trying to get some bishop to disperse the rebels, and then sending the king out to them more than once, but never will they actually make any counter-proposals or offer any real conditions for their agreement. They'll just say yes to nearly everything until they feel they can get away with not saying yes, and then drop the hammer. Doesn't seem like much of a negotiation to me. Seems more like the plan was a bit more cunning and ruthless than negotiation implies. Anyway, however you want to describe it, they put the king in a boat, and dozens of their best soldiers in some other boats, and all these boats rowed down the River Thames to speak to a big cluster of rebels. Now, the big royal barge was maneuvered offshore, and the king asked them from across the water, "Yo, what you want, I'm here to hear you out," more or less. And the rebels, we think Wat Tyler was there, by the by, but he might not have been, responded probably with something like, hey, we can barely hear you, and this is weird. Why are we shouting across the water with a bunch of soldiers between us? Come ashore, let's talk this out at our leisure, and we'll prove to you that we mean it. For King Richard and the true commons, that's our cause. I'm sure the king's party and the king were nervous considering this idea. I'm almost assured that the king really would have been safe if he had come ashore. It might seem strange to place true faith in a teenage king of a country whose real wealth and power is held by a great nobility, but he was their link to God Almighty, and an absolute necessity if you were to even have a country and a people. The source of all legal and spiritual power under heaven's creation in England. Nonetheless, according to the primary sources of the time, one of the king's fathead nobles protested that the rebels were not properly dressed or fit to receive his royal majesty, and that was that. Back up the Thames, they rowed and went back to the Tower. I guess assuming all the rebels would go home and put on better clothes before trying another audience. Well, the rebels did not do that. Instead, they went to visit the king at his house and marched up to London Bridge. Without too much trouble, the bridge was lowered to them from the inside. Sometimes this is attributed to fear by the defenders' parts, but I personally think sympathy the more likely explanation. Inside of London, there were plenty of potential rebels too, actually, who joined the cause, as well as the sort of opportunistic and immoral types who always yearn to use this sort of thing as an excuse to increase their own fortunes or indulge their own prejudices or bloodlusts. There was some unfortunate targeting of the Flemish by some English xenophobes and their rival business interests. The king fled the city. Rebels took his tower, and all the unfortunate and unpopular advisors the king had left behind in that tower were captured and executed, including the archbishop and the king's treasurer. They might have even been left behind on purpose as sacrificial lambs by the remaining members of the king's circle or the king himself. John of Gaunt, unfortunately, was not caught by our heroes, and never would be, though the rebels did get their hands on his son, the future King Henry IV, and were going to kill him before being talked out of it. They also found the king's mother and sister, but they just made fun of them before letting them leave completely unharmed. One greedy soul tried to steal a bit of treasure from the palace of John Gaunt, and people were so pissed at him that they killed his ass. And for the record, the leader of the force that took the tower is named in court documents. It was a woman named Johanna Ferrer, alongside her husband. 'Twas she who personally dragged the hated archbishop to the chopping block. And she is completely absent from every chronicler's telling of the events, probably due to a combination of ignorance and sexism. Meanwhile, the king was just then at a place called Mile End, east of London, with only a few bodyguards, ready for another audience with some rebels, these ones mostly from Essex. He had had only a little trouble getting out of London, even though it was already simmering in discontent. People did harass and shout grievances at him, but let the gate down for him when he passed all the same. When he got there, he met the rebels, he heard all their demands, and he said yes. Okay, sure, yes, no problem, all of it. Yes, sounds good. Now, to modern sympathies, these people might seem ignorant and naive. Certainly their contemporary noble opponents thought just that. Certainly many commentators throughout history have thought that. But they weren't so naive that they were just going to believe that that was that. Instead, His Majesty had to set up a tent, and he and about 36 clerks spent the entire day signing charters of freedom and doing the legal business of abolishing serfdom and beginning the redistribution of vast monastery and church estates to the commons, repealing wage caps, everything basically. Though no action on handing anyone over for execution or decreeing as such yet. King just insists on a trial, you understand. For now, this is no problem for the rebels. There's plenty to do, and the king spent all day writing the legalese equivalent of, "I'm a little bitch who got his ass whooped, I give up." However, as the days passed, the king went back not to London Tower, but to a fortified bolt hole to plan the crown's next action. And Wat Tyler's mostly Kentish forces held London, busying themselves with killing every lawyer they could find, mostly. Now, many people had begun drifting home at this point. Some because they worried for their homes and farms. Some because they believed, or chose to believe, that their victory was achieved. Some because they had suffered wounds. One might call it a mistake to do this, but doing so won't change the fact that these people were subject to the fortunes of nature and the realities of hardscrabble farm life, every bit as much as they were subject to the forces of the crown. The king had acceded to all their demands, save the immediate delivery of the heads of their most hated enemies, and he had spent all day issuing legal documentation to that effect. If you took the rule of law seriously, feudalism was over, and an entirely new form of society and government in England was newborn. But of course, no one takes the rule of law less seriously than the ruling class, who rule because they have power on their side, not justice. Cease quoting laws to we who have swords girt about us. So Plutarch has Pompey the Great say, anyway. And that sentiment's pretty universal across time and geography. In what was probably a trap from the very beginning, the king's party and the remaining rebels, probably less peasant than they had been at the start, but mostly still composed of Kentish and London peoples, led by Wat Tyler, agreed to meet at Smithfield, just outside London's walls. It's a weird little spot, in that people had grown accustomed to spilling blood there over time. Animals were butchered there for many, many years to serve the London population, a business which no one wanted inside the nice city of London, of course. It was also the spot where William Wallace, sometimes called Braveheart, was drawn and quartered generations prior. On this June day, the 15th probably, about 2 weeks after Sir Bampton, whose first name last week I gave as Thomas, but whose name was John, sorry, had first arrived in Essex and been told that the poor folk of the land had already paid their taxes and would be paying no more, more blood was spilled at Smithfield. What happened exactly is described by chroniclers with a theatricality that smacks of embellishment or even fabrication. And different chroniclers have different details, mostly color to make Wat Tyler look like more of an asshole. So I'll keep to the generally accepted narrative about what happened, but add my own color, thank you. Anyway, there's a crowd of armed rebels. Some of them have longbows, others with clubs, spears, daggers, old swords, improvised weapons made of hedging bills and threshing sticks, and Wat Tyler is their leader. Opposite them, the king and his men, well armed and armored, but not numerous, and not so well armed that they had definitive military superiority. This was a face-off between forces close enough in strength that it was probably an open question who would win in a straight-up battle, is what I'm saying. And if I had to put a bet down one way or the other, I'd put it on the rebels. King Richard II, all 14 years of him, called Wat Tyler forth, and the two men met and talked before their assembled forces. The king is said to have inquired why he and his buddies hadn't gone home yet, as he had already acceded to their demands and signed charters to that effect. Tyler replied, "Yeah, well, that was all great, but we're not really done. We need some further charters on the crown's courts, the church, and redistributing that wealth of the great landed estates, And the king said, "Well, yeah, I know, but like I said yes already, and we're already sending charters out like crazy, and we're gonna do all that shit. For real, dog, I promise." And so they're going back and forth like this. And here I'll just break into a bit of speculation. Wat Tyler starts to feel like maybe this little snot-nosed prick is trying to fast-talk him. And maybe he doesn't seem to appreciate the fact that the rebels have consciously framed all their actions in the name of the king. Hell, the rebels probably even carried the king's colors. And maybe his grace should be a bit more respectful of his people, or just trying to rid his inner circle of corrupt and self-serving nobles and bring everyone under his sovereignty equally. So Wat Tyler calls for a bit of water to quench his thirst during the hot summer meeting. It is brought. He swirls it around his mouth a bit, spits it on the ground before the boy king. Then Wat Tyler says, "Now, I'll take some beer, a proper beverage for a proper discussion." Beer is brought, it is drunk, and then in what was probably a staged provocation, some snot-nosed little squire from the king's party starts squealing. "Oi," he says, or he might have if he knew how to speak something like modern English, pointing at Tyler. "You! I know you. You're the biggest thief and liar in all of Kent. Your mother was a hamster, and your father smelt of elderberries." And so Wat Tyler politely excused himself from discussions with His Majesty and set off to engage in a free exchange of high-level ideas with the squire, starting with the idea that the squire in question was dreadfully devoid of stab wounds. But there was one man there, the Mayor of London as it happens. He's an anti-free speech warrior. He is zealously opposed to the idea of Wat Tyler and the squire debating the proposition that it is right and proper for the squire to possess a series of small holes in his body. He was so opposed to this, in fact, that he took out a blade himself and started slashing and stabbing at Tyler. Or maybe Tyler fought him first. But either way, Tyler, who was armored but taken off guard by the first blows, it seems, fell off his horse, riding the few dozen yards back to his comrades, and then was set upon by the king's servants. Not everyone, not even most people, saw what happened. Wat Tyler's body would eventually be taken to a nearby monastery, where some monks tried their best to keep him alive, but he was probably already dead when the king's men dragged his body outside, lopped off the head, and paraded it about London on a stick. But in the meantime, the rebels in the front began to panic. Bows and weapons were drawn, and it might have been a fight. Now, the king's bodyguard was better armed and trained than most of the rebels, but few in number. If you counted up everyone in the royalist party from the highest courtier to the lowest servant, and everyone in between, you'd get maybe a couple hundred people, not all of them ready to fight. The rebels, between 2 and 3 times that number, and pretty much all ready to fight. Fate really did probably hang in the balance. Perhaps the rebels would have fought and won, and a full-scale civil war and possible revolution might have erupted. The rebels might have organized and garrisoned castles, consolidated territory, made inroads with the country's burgeoning craftsmen and guilds, converted more small gentry and clergy to their banner, forged a new army capable of standing up to the crown's best soldiers and mercenaries, and created a completely new kind of nation. There is no telling how vast the possibilities that hung in the balance. They might have tried all of that, and if they had, it certainly would have been difficult, likely an impossible task. But I've got good news for you and bad news. The good news is that we are free to imagine such a world, that we can allow ourselves the luxury of imagining that these people, with their leader dead but their dreams of freedom not, the king mounted and striding towards them, their longbows at hand, might have begun the process of all I have described and birthed an entirely new way of life. If only they had started by killing that shitty little teenage monarch and all of his goons. The bad news is, they didn't do that. The king shouted that he was their king and leader, and that the rebels should follow him to nearby Clerkenwell, basically just a field. And by this, most assumed probably that he was going to settle all of this once and for all and start issuing some more charters. Some of the rebels dispersed, some probably went looking for Wat Tyler, but most of them followed their king. Meanwhile, the Londoners themselves had formed a sizable militia, and instead of charters, the rebels were shown their leader's head on a pike, as I described before. Most of them fell to their knees in supplication and begged the king for amnesty. Some fled without bothering with that formality. Amnesty was granted for the moment to defuse the situation. This was the beginning of the end of the Peasants' Revolt, if not the end exactly. There would be no land redistribution or democratically created laws, no expanded commons, no end to feudalism and dawn of a new age at the hands of the rebels. They had failed and would be crushed. Some literally rode down by men on horseback, while they waved the king's charter of freedom before them as a desperate shield. The Peasants' Revolt ended more or less the same as the summer did, and Little King Dick II Electric Boogaloo is quoted by one contemporary as telling the rebels days later, quote, "You wretches, detestable on land and sea, you who seek equality with lords are unworthy to live. Give this message to your colleagues. Rustics you were, and rustics you are still. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably harsher. For as long as we live, we will strive to suppress you, and your misery will be an example in the eyes of posterity." In a final twist, though, the king's threats of an even more oppressive existence than before would turn out to be hollow. The aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt is more complicated than it failed and was crushed, of course. And next episode, we will talk a little bit more about that aftermath, the end of feudalism in England, and what the rebels' vision for revolutionary change would have looked like if they'd succeeded, and what, if anything, any of that has to do with socialism. Because what a peasant is, whether they are tragic figures of limited imagination and thus incapable of revolution, a reactionary group that requires subjugation to a project of the industrial proletariat, or both, or something else entirely, one thing I'm sure of is that people today aren't so different. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. And yes, that's right. Next week I'm going to do a terrible thing and actually begin to explore what some Marxists thought about peasants and whether or not they have any characteristics that perhaps are analogous to the characteristics of today's people, both in the United States and throughout the world. In other words, I'm getting ready to piss everyone off, I guess, I hope, if anyone listens to this. But if you are listening to this, I just want you to know, that's awesome. And if you want to be even more awesome, patreon.com/distant peasant, playpal.me/distant peasant. See you